I did not disappear. I just turned off my phone once. The night before a flight my husband and I saved 2 years for. My family called with a familiar emergency. For the first time, I said no. 11 hours later, my screen showed 43 missed calls. The chill down my spine was not about them. It was the 3 calls from a bank, 2 from a lawyer, and 1 text confirming a transaction I never made. My name is Riley Hughes. I am 37 years old, and by all outward appearances, I am a woman who has her life immaculately put together. I work as the Director of Project Operations at Stonemere Civic Works, an infrastructure development firm here in Portland. In my professional life, my entire existence revolves around looking at complex, multi-million-dollar blueprints and anticipating exactly where the structural failures will occur. I identify the weak spots. I reinforce the load-bearing walls, and I ensure that when the pressure drops or the storms come, the bridge does not collapse. It is a job that requires a meticulous eye, a high tolerance for stress, and an unwavering ability to remain completely detached while fixing other people's catastrophic mistakes. I live in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood with my husband, Evan Brooks, a man whose steady, patient nature is the exact opposite of the chaotic environment I was raised in. Together, we have built a peaceful, predictable life. But predictability is a luxury my family has never truly allowed me to afford. I was never the rebellious teenager. I never ran away. I never failed my classes. And I never caused a scene. I was, by default, the most stable person in the room. I was the sturdy foundation. But in the Hughes family, being the sturdy foundation simply means you are the one expected to carry the weight of the entire house when the roof inevitably caves in. For as long as I can remember, I have been the designated crisis manager. Whenever there was a late bill, a flawed contract, an angry client, or a relative who suddenly needed cash by Friday afternoon to avoid disaster, it was my phone that rang. Our family universe has always revolved around my younger brother, Caleb. If I was the load-bearing wall, Caleb was the ornate, expensive, terrifyingly fragile chandelier hanging from the ceiling, constantly threatening to crash down on all of us. Caleb is what my parents, Dennis and Marla Hughes, affectionately call a visionary. In reality, he is a man who leaps from one half-baked passion project to another, leaving a trail of financial and logistical wreckage in his wake. First, it was the boutique event studio that lasted exactly 8 months before the landlord evicted him. Then came the artisan food truck, a venture that burned through tens of thousands of dollars and folded in 6 weeks because Caleb found the daily grind of cooking too uninspiring. After that, he launched a life coaching masterclass, which naturally yielded 0 paying clients. Now, his grandest ambition to date is Cedar Vale House, a sprawling, rustic wedding venue located just outside the city limits. It is a beautiful property, but running a high-end event space requires a level of detail and discipline that Caleb simply does not possess. My parents have always enabled him. Over Sunday pot roast, my father would proudly tell anyone who would listen that Caleb has the entrepreneurial spirit, a wild, untamed genius that cannot be confined to a corporate cubicle. In the very next breath, my mother would pat my hand and say, "And our Riley is the practical one." I used to think being the practical one was a compliment. It took me years to realize that in their vocabulary. Practical simply meant I was the designated janitor for their golden boy's dreams. For years, I have been the silent, invisible force keeping Caleb's head above water. When he drafted contracts for Cedar Vale that were full of glaring legal loopholes, I was the one rewriting them at 2 in the morning so he would not get sued by a bride. When he mismanaged his operating budget and could not pay his seasonal staff, I was the one advancing payroll out of my own savings account so his workers would not walk off the property. I spent countless lunch hours stepping out of my own important meetings to negotiate with angry florists, caterers, and lighting vendors, smoothing things over just to keep the family name from being dragged through the local business mud. The most deeply frustrating part was that no one in my family ever viewed my interventions as a sacrifice. There was never any genuine gratitude, only a relieved entitlement. When I managed to talk a furious caterer out of canceling a gig 12 hours before a reception, my mother simply sighed and said, "Well, Riley is just good at these things. She knows how to talk to people." It was as if my competence, my time, and my money existed merely as a public utility, free for them to tap into whenever Caleb's entrepreneurial spirit ran out of funds. Evan saw it all. He watched me cancel our Friday date nights to balance Caleb's chaotic ledgers. He watched me endure interrupted Sunday mornings, pacing in our living room while talking my mother down from a panic attack because Caleb had dodged another vendor call. Evan is a high school science teacher. He understands cause and effect better than anyone. He never issued ultimatums or demanded I cut them off. He would just stand in the doorway of my home office, hand me a fresh cup of coffee while I was hunched over my laptop fixing another Hughes family disaster, and gently say, "You know, you are not everyone's fire department." His words always stung because they were completely true. I was exhausted from smelling the smoke. That exhaustion was exactly why Evan and I had been quietly funneling portions of our paychecks into a high-yield savings account for the past 2 years. We were planning our dream anniversary trip, a 10-day escape to Lisbon and the Azores. It was meant to be our first truly long, uninterrupted vacation since our honeymoon. I desperately needed the cobbled streets, the salty ocean winds, and the absolute guarantee that I would be thousands of miles away from Cedar Vale House. I knew my family well enough to feel a deep, nagging bad feeling about the trip. In the Hughes household, an unavailable Riley is an unhelpful Riley, and they do not handle my absence well. I tried my hardest to keep the exact dates and details a secret, offering only vague answers when my mother asked about our summer plans. But secrets are hard to keep during our mandatory Sunday family dinners. 2 weeks before our departure, amidst the clinking of silverware and the passing of the roast chicken, my mother cornered me about scheduling a family barbecue. Without thinking, I slipped and mentioned the exact date of our outbound flight to Lisbon. The energy in the dining room shifted instantly. The easy chatter died down. I saw Caleb pause, his fork hovering midair. He slowly turned his head to look at me, a familiar, lazy smirk spreading across his face. "Wow, Europe," Caleb said, his voice dripping with that careless confidence that always made my stomach turn. He took a slow sip of his water, his eyes locking onto mine across the table. "Hope there is no house fire right when you take off," he laughed, a short, sharp sound, and my parents chuckled along, completely oblivious to the weight of the comment. But sitting there, looking at my brother's smiling face, a sudden, freezing sense of dread washed over me. It was not a joke. It was a warning. The 2 hard-shell suitcases stood like sentinels by the front door. I ran my thumb over the gold lettering on our passports one last time, feeling the satisfying weight of them in my palm. Evan was in the living room, double-checking the window locks and adjusting the thermostat. The house was quiet, filled with the specific, humming anticipation of an impending departure. I glanced at the glowing red numbers on the microwave display. It was exactly 10:11 p.m. Our flight was scheduled to board at 6:30 a.m. Then, the silence shattered. My phone vibrated violently against the granite kitchen island, the screen lighting up the darkened room. The caller ID flashed a name that made my stomach instantly seize. "Mom." I stared at it. Nobody calls at 10:11 on a Thursday night to wish you a pleasant flight. Evan walked into the kitchen, his eyes dropping to the phone and then snapping up to meet mine. He did not say a word, but his posture stiffened. I took a slow, deep breath, bracing myself for the inevitable impact, and swiped the green button. "Riley." My mother did not say hello. She did not ask if I was packed. Her voice was thin, pulled tight like a wire about to snap under immense pressure. "We have an absolute catastrophe on our hands. Mom, it is late." We are leaving for the airport in a few hours. You are not going to the airport, she stated, her tone shifting from panicked to authoritative, bypassing any room for discussion. You need to unpack your bags and get some sleep. I need you at Caleb's office at Cedar Vale by 5 a.m. sharp tomorrow. I gripped the edge of the counter. The granite felt ice cold beneath my fingertips. Excuse me? What are you talking about? Caleb is in a massive bind, she continued, her words tumbling out in a rushed, frantic rhythm. There is a massive wedding booked for this weekend. 300 guests arriving tomorrow afternoon. But there has been a glitch with the accounts. The florists, the caterers, and the lighting crew are refusing to set up tomorrow morning unless they get paid in full by 6 a.m. It is a logistical nightmare. Riley. If they walk, the wedding is ruined, and Cedar Vale is finished. They will sue him into the ground. A familiar, nauseating wave of adrenaline flooded my system. It was the same script, just a different stage. And why exactly do I need to be at his office at 5 a.m.? Caleb found a solution, she said quickly, glossing over the severity of the situation like she was pitching a minor inconvenience. He secured a short-term bridge funding loan to cover the vendor costs until the wedding final payments clear next week. But the lender needs a secondary guarantor. Just a temporary signature on the paperwork. Someone with a spotless credit history and a stable corporate income. The sheer audacity of the request hung in the air between us. You want me to co-sign a commercial loan for Caleb? I asked, my voice dropping an octave. Hours before I leave the country. It is just a formality. Riley, a temporary hold. You will not actually pay a single dime. We just need your name on the file so the funds get released tomorrow morning. If it is just a formality, why does Caleb not sign it himself or Dad? Why can you two not use your house as collateral? My mother let out a sharp, exasperated sigh, the kind she reserved for when I was being deliberately difficult. You know your father and I are overextended right now, and Caleb's credit is tied up in the property renovations. You have the clean record. You have the Stonemere Civic Works title. You are the only one capable enough to save the family right now. There it was, the magic phrase, the emotional blackmail wrapped up in a compliment. As she spoke, my phone vibrated twice against my ear. I pulled it away for a fraction of a second to look at the screen. Notifications were popping up from our family group chat. The first message was from Caleb. It read, "Just need your help for 48 hours. You can fly out later. Do not be selfish right now." The second message arrived a moment later. It was from my father, a man of very few words, especially when it came to his son's failures. It read, "Family first. Do not make this harder." I stared at the glowing text bubbles. Do not be selfish right now. The words echoed in my mind, rattling against every memory I had of the last decade. I looked up at Evan. He was leaning against the doorframe, his arms crossed, watching me intently. He did not look angry. He just looked incredibly sad for me. In that brief, suspended moment, a massive projector reel played in my head. I saw the weekend getaway to the coast we canceled 4 years ago because Caleb needed help managing a crisis at his failed food truck. I saw the thousands of dollars I quietly transferred to cover his bounced checks. Money I never saw again. I saw the sleepless nights I spent drafting apology emails to his clients while he slept off his stress. Every single time. I had folded. Every single time. I had prioritized their chaos over my own peace. Convinced that it was my duty as the practical daughter to absorb the shockwaves of his incompetence. They did not want me to stay because they loved me. They wanted me to stay because I was the only asset they had left to leverage. I lifted the phone back to my ear. My mother was already talking over me, listing off the documents I needed to bring to the office at 5 a.m. She was planning my route, completely certain that I had already surrendered. "Mom," I said, "make sure you bring 2 forms of ID Riley. The notary is going to be there early." "Mom, stop talking," I commanded. The line went dead silent. It was a shocking, unnatural quiet. I had never raised my voice to her. I had never interrupted her when she was in the middle of a crisis management routine. I took another breath, feeling a strange, terrifying calm wash over me. The trembling in my hands completely stopped. "No." "What did you just say?" she whispered, genuine disbelief coating her words. I said no. I am not driving to Caleb's office. I am not signing my name on any bridge funding loan. And I am absolutely not canceling my trip. The silence shattered into a million jagged pieces. Her voice spiked into a hysterical pitch. "Riley Hughes, you cannot do this. If you do not help us, your brother is going to lose everything. We could lose everything. How can you just walk away when your family is begging you for help?" "Because his lack of preparation is not my emergency," I replied, my voice remarkably steady, devoid of the guilt she was desperately trying to trigger. "I am turning my phone off now. Mom, do not call me again tonight." I pulled the phone away from my ear before she could scream another word and pressed the power button. The screen went black. The house was suddenly, beautifully silent again. I looked at Evan. He slowly uncrossed his arms, a small, proud smile touching the corners of his mouth. He walked over, picked up the passports, and handed mine to me. The next few hours passed in a surreal blur. We barely slept. By 3:30 a.m., we were in the back of a silent rideshare, watching the dark, rain-slicked streets of Portland roll by. By 5 a.m., exactly when my mother had demanded I be sitting in Caleb's office signing away my financial security, I was handing my shoes to a TSA agent when we finally boarded the plane. The sun was just beginning to break over the horizon, casting a brilliant orange glow across the tarmac. I settled into my window seat, snapping the seatbelt across my lap. For the first time in my 37 years, I felt entirely untethered. I had severed the invisible rope they used to drag me back. I had chosen myself. The engines roared to life, a deep, vibrating rumble that shook the cabin. As the plane accelerated down the runway and lifted violently into the morning sky, I leaned my head against the cool acrylic window, watching my city shrink into a grid of tiny lights. I felt a profound sense of victory. I had finally escaped the blast zone, but as we climbed higher through the thick layer of clouds, speeding toward the Atlantic, I had absolutely no idea how wrong I was. I thought by turning off my phone, I had stopped them. I thought my absence was the end of the conversation. I did not know that my family was not just sitting in an office, crying over my refusal. I did not know that while I was miles above the earth, completely unreachable, they were actively taking my silence as an opportunity, frantically typing my name, my personal details, and my credentials into a digital portal to push a massive financial transaction through without me. The wheels of the heavy aircraft struck the Portuguese runway with a solid, reassuring thud, marking the end of our 11-hour journey across the Atlantic. As the engines wound down into a low, steady whine, and the cabin erupted into the familiar symphony of unclicking seatbelts, I felt a profound sense of physical relief. We had made it. The ocean was a massive, impenetrable barrier between my husband and the chaos we had left behind on the West Coast. I reached into my carry-on bag, pulled out my device, and pressed my thumb against the power button. The screen illuminated with a crisp white logo, followed by the lock screen. It hung perfectly still for about 10 seconds as it searched for a foreign cellular network. Then, the connection snapped into place, and the phone jolted violently in my hand. It was not a trickle of notifications. It was an absolute avalanche. The small rectangular screen filled with a cascading waterfall of alerts, vibrating so violently against my palm that I nearly dropped it onto the floor mat. 43 missed calls. My lungs seized. I stared at the red notification bubble hovering over the phone icon. Even for my family. 43 calls in the span of half a day was a staggering escalation. The text messages were rolling in right behind them, stacking up by the dozens. I opened the voicemail app first, pressing the speaker against my ear as the other passengers began shuffling into the aisle. The first few audio files were exactly what I had braced myself for. My mother's voice, shrill and wet with tears, condemning my selfishness. She accused me of abandoning my own flesh and blood, of leaving my brother to drown in the exact hour of his greatest need. Caleb's messages alternated between aggressive, furious demands and pathetic, breathless pleading. But as my eyes scrolled down the list of missed calls, the familiar knot of familial guilt twisted into something entirely different. It turned into a spike of pure, freezing terror. The calls were not just from my parents or my brother. Mingled among the family names were over a dozen missed calls from completely unknown numbers. A quick glance at the caller ID transcripts revealed a chilling pattern. A commercial bank, a boutique trade financing group, a local corporate law firm. This was no longer just a dramatic tantrum over a canceled caterer. I switched over to my email inbox, my thumb trembling slightly against the glass screen. Sitting right at the top of the unread pile was an automated message from a financial institution. The subject line read, "Electronic signature verification required." The recipient's name was mine. I swallowed hard, the dry air of the airplane cabin suddenly feeling suffocating. I quickly toggled back to my text messages and scrolled to Caleb's thread. Amidst his furious tirades about my departure, one single, isolated message stood out. It had been delivered exactly 3 hours after my flight took off. It read, "Just read me the 6-digit one-time password code they just texted you. That is all I need to clear this. Nobody loses anything. I promise." The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath completely out of my chest. They had not just called to scream at me, they had actually proceeded without my consent, while I was 30,000 feet in the air, completely unreachable. Someone in that office had typed my full name, my personal details, and my professional credentials into a commercial loan application. They had tried to push a massive financial transaction through the system, using my identity to legitimize a desperate file, and they had crashed directly into a two-factor authentication wall. Evan leaned over from the middle seat, his shoulder brushing mine. He looked down at the glowing screen, reading Caleb's text message. His jaw tightened instantly, a muscle ticking wildly in his cheek. But when he spoke, his voice remained the calm, heavy anchor I desperately needed. "Listen to the messages," Evan said, his tone even and entirely deliberate, slicing through my rising panic. "Read the emails. Figure out exactly what they did. But we are not letting them destroy the first hour of our anniversary. Handle it smartly. Do not handle it in a panic." He was entirely right. Panic was their native language. It was the currency they used to force compliance. I was a project manager. When a structure was compromised, I did not scream. I documented the failure points. I did not dial my brother back. I did not text my mother to explain myself. Instead, I activated a cold, methodical part of my brain. I took digital screenshots of every single call log. I captured every frantic text thread. I forwarded the electronic signature verification email to a secure, private server. Right there in Seat 14A, I created a new encrypted digital folder. I titled it Cedar Vale. I dropped every single piece of evidence inside, locking it away. We grabbed our bags from the luggage carousel a little while later, as the wheels of my suitcase clattered over the smooth-tiled floor of the arrivals hall. A beautiful, sun-drenched European afternoon was waiting just beyond the sliding glass doors. The air outside smelled of salt and strong espresso, but as I pulled my luggage toward the taxi rank, I could still hear the ghost of my mother's voice echoing persistently in the back of my skull. A deeply ingrained psychological infection. You are the only one capable enough to save the family right now. It took immense effort to push that voice down. By 8 o'clock that evening, Evan and I were sitting on a secluded, terraced patio overlooking the historic Alfama district. The sky was bruising into magnificent shades of deep violet and burnt orange. Plate glass windows reflected the warm glow of hanging lanterns. It was picture perfect. The exact escape we had drained our savings account for. I had almost managed to let the rhythm of the foreign city wash over me, convincing myself that the digital fortress I built at the airport would hold them off. I picked up my wine glass, feeling a fragile sense of peace settling over my shoulders. My phone was sitting face down on the white linen tablecloth. It buzzed softly. A single, distinct vibration. I set my glass down and flipped the device over. The notification on the screen was not from my mother. And it was not another automated banking alert. It was a direct message from my younger cousin, Nora Pike. Nora lived 2 states away and historically avoided my immediate family's chaotic orbit like the plague. I tapped the screen. The message was incredibly brief. Do not answer Caleb. You need to know the truth first. I stared at the glowing text from Nora for a long, fractured moment before my finger finally tapped the video call icon. The screen shifted, connecting across thousands of miles of ocean and continent. Nora appeared, illuminated by the harsh, artificial glare of a desk lamp in her Oregon apartment. She looked exhausted, her hair pulled back into a messy knot, her eyes completely devoid of the usual familial warmth. She did not bother with pleasantries. She leaned closer to the camera and began dismantling the reality I thought I knew. According to Nora, the narrative spreading like wildfire through our extended family was that I was a traitor. My parents and Caleb were actively telling aunts, uncles, and cousins that I had solemnly promised to financially back Cedar Vale House, only to maliciously flee the country at the final hour, leaving my younger brother to face utter ruin alone. They were painting a tragic portrait of a dedicated young entrepreneur destroyed by the sudden, cruel abandonment of his wealthy, selfish sister. I sat completely paralyzed on the beautiful terrace, the warm Lisbon breeze suddenly feeling like ice against my skin. I had never promised them anything. The truth was far more insidious. Caleb had preemptively assured his vendors, his suppliers, and his prospective lenders that his sister, the successful corporate executive, was his silent partner and ultimate safety net. He had weaponized my title and my reputation without my knowledge, offering my financial stability as collateral to people I had never even met. But Nora was not finished. She took a slow, deep breath and delivered the heaviest blow. Cedar Vale House was not just short on cash to pay a local florist or a lighting crew. The venue was drowning in merchant cash advances. Caleb had grown desperate months ago, taking out one predatory, unregulated short-term loan after another. The daily compounding interest rates and astronomical penalty fees were bleeding the business dry. He had pulled money multiple times to cover previous debts, creating a catastrophic, inescapable spiral. The puzzle pieces snapped together in my mind, forming a picture so ugly I had to close my eyes. The barrage of unknown numbers on my call log, the commercial banks, the boutique trade financing groups, the local corporate law firm, they were not wrong numbers. They were not simply hoping to reach Caleb through me. They were calling because my name was already embedded in their files somewhere. I had been woven into the fabric of his fraudulent debt. Evan sat across from me, watching the color drain entirely from my face. He had listened to the entire conversation in silence when Nora finally hung up, leaving us in the quiet hum of the European evening. Evan reached across the white linen tablecloth and took my hand. He looked past the romantic lanterns, his gaze entirely focused and sharp. "They are not panicking because you went on vacation," Evan said, his voice a low, steady rumble that anchored me to the present moment. "They are panicking because for the first time in his life, their tool is not answering the phone." That single sentence hit me with the force of a revelation. I was not a daughter to them. I was not a sister. I was a utility. A wrench to be pulled from the toolbox whenever an engine stalled, and thrown back into the dark the moment the machine was running again. Over the course of the next 2 days, I fought a silent, grueling war within myself to preserve the sanctity of our trip. Outwardly, I played the role of the enchanted traveler, We rode the iconic yellow trams as they screeched up the steep, winding alleys of the Alfama district. We drank dark, bitter espresso in sun-drenched plazas, and ate fresh seafood while listening to the melancholic sounds of fado music drifting through the cobblestone streets. I smiled for the camera, leaning my head against Evan's shoulder, forcing the muscles in my face to project joy. But internally, my mind was a cold, calculating war room. I could not simply turn off my operational instincts. Every night, after Evan had fallen asleep, I would sit by the window with my laptop illuminated in the dark room. I began building a meticulous, chronological timeline. I logged the exact hour and minute of every single missed call. I transcribed the frantic voicemails. I documented the threatening text messages. I cross-referenced the unfamiliar area codes, tracing them back to lending institutions and collections agencies. I was no longer a victim. I was a project manager assessing a critical structural failure. As I organized the data, the physical distance of being on another continent finally allowed the dense fog of my upbringing to lift. Memories I had suppressed for years resurfaced with agonizing clarity. I remembered the blistering summer I drained my checking account to pay the arrears on Caleb's commercial storage unit, just so his catering equipment would not be auctioned off to the highest bidder. I remembered spending an entire weekend rewriting his vendor contracts entirely free of charge. I remembered sitting in the bridal suite at my best friend's wedding, excusing myself from the celebration to frantically negotiate a liability waiver on my phone because Caleb had neglected to secure the proper municipal permits for an outdoor event. Staring at the spreadsheet, the deepest, most profound pain washed over me. The true tragedy was not merely that I had been used. The genuine horror was recognizing that I had been meticulously conditioned from childhood to view my own exploitation as a moral obligation. My parents had raised me to believe that setting a boundary was an act of violence against the family. By the time we boarded our connecting flight to the Azores, a fundamental shift had occurred within my chest. The paralyzing guilt had entirely evaporated, replaced by a cold, protective armor. On our second afternoon on the islands, Evan and I hiked up to a jagged volcanic cliff. We stood together, looking out over the vast, churning expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The wind whipped fiercely across the grassy precipice, carrying the sharp, clean scent of salt and ancient stone. The sheer, untamed power of the landscape felt intensely liberating. I turned to Evan, the man who had weathered every single one of my family's storms without a word of complaint. I squeezed his hand, my grip firm and resolute. Looking into his eyes, I made a quiet, unbreakable vow. The era of blind rescue missions was permanently over. I would no longer be the emotional or financial buffer for Caleb's delusions or my parents' enabling. I promised Evan, and more importantly, I promised myself, that upon our return to Portland, I would not step foot in their house to play the role of the dutiful savior. I would treat this exactly like the corporate crisis it was. I would demand physical evidence. I would scrutinize the legal documentation, and I would verify every single fact before I ever uttered a single word to my family again. The descent into Portland brought a heavy, gray curtain of rain that instantly washed away the vibrant, sunlit memories of the Atlantic Islands. When the plane finally taxied to the gate, the deeply ingrained urge to reach out to my parents flared up in my chest, a phantom limb of daughterly duty that I had lived with my entire life. I actively ignored it. I did not drive to their quiet suburban house to announce my return. I did not send a brief text message confirming we had landed safely. Instead, Evan went home to our quiet neighborhood to unpack the suitcases, and I drove my car directly to the towering glass and steel headquarters of Stonemere Civic Works. The moment I swiped my security badge and stepped onto the 12th floor, the sterile, predictable hum of the corporate environment grounded me. This was my true domain. Here, every crisis had a blueprint, every failure had a quantifiable metric, and every problem had a logical, structural solution. The messy, emotional manipulation of the Hughes family did not exist within these walls. At precisely 12:30 in the afternoon, I closed the heavy oak door of my private office, pulled the blinds completely shut, and opened the encrypted digital folder on my laptop. I took a slow, steadying breath, picked up my desk phone, and dialed the first unknown number on the meticulously logged spreadsheet I had created in Europe. A polite, automated voice routed me through a brief menu before connecting me to a representative at a boutique commercial lending firm. I introduced myself simply, provided my contact number, and asked why they had attempted to reach me multiple times over the past week while I was traveling out of the country. The representative, a man with a brisk, highly transactional tone, tapped away at his keyboard for a few agonizing seconds. Then, he cheerfully informed me that they were simply trying to finalize the identity verification process for the emergency capital advance requested by Cedar Vale Event Holdings, a limited liability company. I gripped the smooth edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white. I asked him, keeping my voice dangerously level and devoid of any panic, what exact role my name played in that specific commercial application. The representative read straight from his monitor. He stated, with absolute casualness, that I was officially listed as the backup guarantor and the primary operations contact for the venue. The sheer staggering audacity of the betrayal stole the breath from my lungs. But I did not yell. I did not break down. I used my project manager voice, the exact authoritative tone I used to broker multi-million-dollar concrete disputes with hostile contractors. I informed him with absolute, icy clarity that I had never seen, authorized, or signed any financial application for his firm. I demanded a complete, unredacted copy of the entire digital and physical file immediately. The representative's cheerful demeanor vanished instantly, replaced by a wall of cautious corporate liability. He became highly defensive, stating that strict company policy prevented him from releasing the full financial dossier without a verified electronic signature, the very signature they were trying to secure from me in the first place. I did not argue. I simply instructed him to immediately flag the account with a formal, documented dispute and a high-level fraud concern. I wrote down his full name, his employee identification number, and the exact minute our conversation concluded. My nightmare was only beginning. Just 2 hours later, an administrative assistant knocked hesitantly on my office door and handed me a thick, stiff cardboard envelope sent via an expedited legal courier service. It was addressed directly to me, but the sender was a prominent regional commercial litigation firm. I sliced the top open with a metal letter opener. Inside was a formal, aggressive demand for payment regarding an outstanding invoice for large-scale floral installations and audiovisual equipment rentals. The total sum was staggering, representing tens of thousands of dollars in unpaid vendor services. But the most terrifying part of the document was not the astronomical amount owed. It was the paragraph at the very bottom of the second page, which explicitly and legally named me as the authorized financial representative for the Cedar Vale property. This was the exact moment the ground truly gave way beneath my feet. This situation was no longer just an annoying family boundary issue. It was not a simple matter of turning off my cellular device to avoid being emotionally harassed. My personal identity, my spotless credit history, and my corporate title were being actively weaponized as a layer of institutional security within a complex system of legal paperwork. They were building a massive, fragile fortress of debt, and they were using my hard-earned credibility as the foundational mortar. I needed professional, ruthless artillery. A senior partner at my firm had once quietly recommended a fierce civil and commercial litigation attorney named Leona Graves. I managed to leverage my corporate title to secure an emergency consultation at 4 o'clock that same afternoon. Leona's office was completely devoid of warmth, filled with towering metal filing cabinets, heavy leather chairs, and sharp abstract art. She was a meticulous, calculating woman who did not waste a single second with sympathetic nods or comforting platitudes. I sat across from her massive mahogany desk and presented my digital evidence. I handed her the printed screenshots of the 43 missed calls, the automated one-time password verification texts, and the commercial signature requests. I laid out the exact timeline of my outbound flight, physically proving I was thousands of miles in the air over the ocean when the network logged the fraudulent activity from Portland. Leona reviewed the stack of documents in complete, unnerving silence for several long minutes. When she finally looked up, her expression was entirely grave. She delivered a piece of advice that was both utterly terrifying and incredibly clarifying. If you suspect forgery or identity theft, you must act with immediate, aggressive legal force, Leona instructed, tapping a perfectly manicured fingernail against the top page of the call logs. In the eyes of the law, and certainly in the eyes of aggressive corporate creditors, hesitation is very often interpreted as implicit consent. If you delay, if you wait to see how this plays out simply because they are your family members, a judge or a collections agency might look at your silence and assume you were silently backing the play the entire time. The professional stakes extended far beyond my personal bank accounts. At that very moment, within the walls of Stonemere Civic Works, I was in the final, delicate stages of being vetted to lead the largest public infrastructure initiative our company had ever secured. It was a massive municipal project that required intense financial scrutiny and top-level government clearance. If a messy, highly public legal battle involving fraudulent commercial loans and defaulted vendor payments exploded with my name attached to it, the corporate board of directors would drop me without a single second thought. My professional reputation, the one beautiful thing I had built entirely on my own, completely separate from the Hughes family chaos, was dangling precariously over a deep precipice. Walking out of Leona's office into the cool, damp evening air, a profound and irreversible transformation took hold of my mind. For 37 years, my absolute default response to my family had been deeply rooted in raw emotion. It was always a messy cocktail of guilt, anger, deep resentment, and a crushing sense of biological obligation. Historically, I would have driven straight to my parents' house right then, slammed my hands down on their dining room table, and engaged in a bitter screaming match that would inevitably end with my mother crying and my father demanding I show some familial loyalty. I made a different choice. I decided in that quiet moment on the sidewalk not to make a single angry phone call. I would not send Caleb a furious text message. I would not give any of them the satisfaction of witnessing my emotional distress. They had coldly treated my identity like a disposable corporate asset, so I was going to treat them exactly like a hostile corporate entity. I was not just setting a boundary anymore. I was initiating a full, silent, and methodical investigation. I was going to build an impenetrable, legally binding case against my own flesh and blood. And I was going to do it without them ever hearing my footsteps approaching, within 48 hours of my retaining her services. Leona Graves demonstrated exactly why she commanded such an exorbitant hourly rate. She did not waste time with polite inquiries or exploratory phone calls. Instead, she drafted a severe, legally binding document preservation notice. This notice was dispatched via certified mail and secure electronic delivery to the Alternative Lending Company, the 3 specific event vendors demanding payment, and directly to the registered corporate address of Cedar Vale Event Holdings. It was a legal shockwave, an absolute mandate requiring every recipient to instantly freeze, back up, and retain every single email, text message, server log, and printed contract related to my name. Destroying or altering anything after receiving that notice could expose them to serious sanctions and potential criminal liability. The Alternative Lending Institution, terrified of being entirely compromised by a high-level corporate fraud investigation, was the first to comply. By the middle of the week, Leona summoned me back to her mahogany-paneled office. When I sat down, she silently slid a thick white physical file folder across the desk. I opened the cover. The very first document was a printed copy of the Digital Guarantee Addendum. Right there, on the bottom right corner of the page, was an electronic signature bearing my full legal name. My eyes instantly darted to the digital timestamp printed in the margin. It read 6:15 in the morning, Pacific Standard Time. I felt a cold, hard knot form in my stomach. That was the exact, verifiable minute I was standing barefoot on the cold tile of the airport security screening area, handing my physical passport to a TSA agent. But Leona was not looking at the time. She tapped her pen against a string of numbers printed just below the signature line. "Look at the IP address logged by the digital signing software," Leona instructed, her voice completely devoid of emotion. "When an electronic document is executed, the system records the exact Internet protocol address of the device used. We ran a trace on this sequence of numbers. It did not originate from a cellular tower near the international airport. It resolved to a fixed, commercial broadband account. Specifically, the Internet service provider registered to the physical office address of Cedar Vale House." The air in the room felt suddenly thin. Someone had been sitting at my brother's desk, logging into a financial portal, and actively pretending to be me while I was physically incapable of stopping them, as if sensing the walls closing in. My phone buzzed in my purse. It was a direct text message from Caleb. He had undoubtedly received the preservation notice from Leona's firm and realized the situation had escalated far beyond a family argument. The message read, "Riley, you need to call your attack dog off. I was just temporarily filling in your information on the portal to hold our place in line for the funding deadline. It was just a placeholder. Nothing actually ran. I swear. Nobody is in trouble." I stared at the screen, struck by the pathetic, juvenile nature of the lie. I looked up at Leona and read the text aloud. She let out a sharp, humorless sound that might have been a laugh under different circumstances. "He is lying to you," Leona stated flatly. She flipped to the third page in the folder. It was a ledger of transactions provided by the lender. They do not hold places in line for commercial bridge funding. Once the electronic signature cleared the automated system, it triggered an immediate release of capital. A partial disbursement of $35,000 was wired directly into the Cedar Vale operating account yesterday morning. He took the money. Riley. The floor seemed to tilt beneath my chair, but the horrifying revelations were not over. As Leona and I dug deeper into the foundational corporate documents the lender had provided to verify the business structure, I found something that made my blood run entirely cold. Buried in a revised operating agreement dated exactly 1 year ago, Caleb had formally listed me as a strategic member of his limited liability company. It was a fabricated title designed to lend heavy corporate credibility to his chaotic enterprise. Beside my printed name was a physical, scanned signature. It looked terrifyingly authentic. I stared at the looping letters, racking my brain, until a mundane memory violently surfaced. 14 months ago, Caleb was running late to his own venue for a massive wedding setup. He had begged me to swing by the property to let the floral vendor inside. The delivery driver had handed me a digital tablet, and I had quickly signed my name on the screen to acknowledge receipt of the white roses. Caleb had somehow accessed that vendor receipt, digitally cropped my signature, and pasted it directly onto his internal corporate formation documents. I had been an unwitting, non-consenting partner in his financial house of cards for an entire year. The scope of the deception forced me to reevaluate everything, including my parents. I realized with absolute clarity that Dennis and Marla Hughes had to have known about the impending collapse for months. They had hidden the truth from me intentionally. They knew Caleb was trapped in a lethal cycle of merchant cash advances, taking out new, high-interest loans simply to pay the daily compounding penalties on the old ones. They knew that if I saw the actual ledgers, I would instantly refuse to fund a sinking ship. They needed me blind, panicked, and reacting to an emotional emergency so I would sign the bridge funding without demanding an audit. That evening, the final, agonizing piece of the puzzle fell into place. My cousin Nora sent me another text message, updating me on the family gossip network. My mother had taken her defensive campaign to an entirely new, vicious level. Marla was now actively telling our aunts and uncles that I was a deeply bitter, controlling woman. Her new narrative was that I had secretly monitored Caleb's finances for years, hoarding my own wealth, and was now intentionally orchestrating his total ruin just to prove to the entire family that I was the superior, practical child. The sheer magnitude of the psychological projection was breathtaking. The pain of hearing those words, of knowing my own mother was assassinating my character to protect a criminal act, was a physical ache in my chest. Yet, amidst the profound hurt, a strange, liberating clarity washed over me. This was not a mistake. This was not a desperate, one-time incident caused by a stressful weekend. This was the fundamental operating system of the Hughes family. They existed in a manufactured reality where the truth was entirely malleable, constantly bent and reshaped to serve Caleb's endless needs. I had not just been a sister, I had been a targeted resource. I sat back in the heavy leather chair in the law office, looking at the undeniable paper trail of my family's betrayal. Leona closed the folder and folded her hands on the desk. "We stand at a crossroads, Riley," Leona said, her tone shifting to strict legal strategy. "I can take these documents directly to the State Attorney General and the Commercial Fraud Division this afternoon. Your brother will face immediate criminal indictment, and your parents will likely be implicated as co-conspirators. That is the first option." She paused, letting the weight of the criminal justice system hang in the air. "The second option," Leona continued, "is that we bypass the police for now. We bring your family to the table and offer them a private settlement with absolutely draconian, ironclad conditions. We force them to legally dismantle their leverage over you, strip Caleb of his power, and sign binding admissions of guilt that we hold over their heads in perpetuity." I did not hesitate. I did not choose the second option because I was softening. I did not choose it out of some lingering sense of familial loyalty or a desire to protect my mother from the consequences of her slander. I chose the second option because handing Caleb over to the state meant losing control of the narrative. The legal system would eventually process him. But I wanted something far more absolute. I wanted to look them in the eye, lay the forged documents on the table, and systematically strip away every single illusion they held about their golden boy and their practical daughter. I wanted the power, and I was going to use it to rewrite the rules of our entire existence. The silence from my family lasted exactly 4 days. Then, the psychological warfare shifted tactics. My phone rang on a Thursday afternoon. It was my mother. I let it ring 3 times before answering, keeping my breathing perfectly even. When Marla spoke, the hysterical, accusatory shrillness that had defined our last conversation was entirely gone. In its place was a soft, maternal, almost fragile tone. It was the voice she used when she wanted to pretend the world was perfectly fine. She invited me to Sunday dinner. She specifically requested I come over at 6 o'clock in the evening, just days before Cedar Vale was set to host a massive, multi-day wedding event. She framed it as an opportunity for us to sit down, break bread, and talk through our misunderstandings like mature adults. A few minutes after I hung up, a text message arrived from Caleb. It was brief and aggressively casual. He wrote that I should leave my lawyer at home. Family business, he insisted, should be handled strictly within the family. That single text message was all the confirmation I needed. They were not looking for a reconciliation. They were setting a trap. They wanted to isolate me, strip away my legal protection, and use the familiar, suffocating environment of my childhood dining room to force me back into submission. I agreed to attend, but I had absolutely no intention of walking into that house unarmed, while I would be physically alone. I was bringing an invisible fortress with me. Leona and I spent Friday morning compiling a physical dossier. We did not rely on digital files that could be dismissed or ignored. We built a heavy black leather binder. Inside, we placed the chronological timeline of the fraud, high-resolution color printouts of the incriminating text messages, and a brutal, ironclad draft of a settlement agreement. Evan and I spent Saturday evening in our living room, running through the scenario like a tactical drill. We made the strategic decision that he would stay home. If he came with me, my parents would instantly weaponize his presence. They would accuse him of turning me against them. shifting the narrative into a bitter battle between the husband and the blood relatives. I needed this to be solely about my autonomy and their theft. Evan paced across the rug, playing the role of my mother, then my father, then Caleb. He threw their classic manipulative phrases at me. He helped me practice the art of the hard stop. I rehearsed delivering short, emotionless responses. I practiced letting uncomfortable silences hang in the air without rushing to fill them with apologies. "Remember the objective," Evan said quietly, handing me a glass of water. "You are not there to win their love. You are there to serve them notice." My confidence was not just coming from Evan or Leona. That same week, at Stonemere Civic Works, I had stood in front of the executive board and delivered the final operational presentation for our new multi-million-dollar municipal infrastructure project. I had commanded the room. I had answered their aggressive financial inquiries with absolute precision, securing the final approval for a massive budget. The contrast was jarring and deeply empowering. I was a highly respected corporate director who managed enormous risks for a living. I was entirely done trembling like a frightened child every time I pulled into my parents' driveway. I established 3 unbreakable boundaries for the evening. First, I would absolutely not engage in any debate about my anniversary vacation. The moment they brought up my trip to Europe as a deflection, I would steer the conversation violently back to the forged documents. Second, under no circumstances would I offer a single cent of my own money to bail Caleb out of his immediate cash flow crisis. Third, my pen would not touch a single piece of paper they provided at that table. Before placing the black binder into my leather tote bag, I added one final, devastating piece of leverage. It was a formal, multi-page complaint drafted by Leona, addressed directly to the State Department of Financial Fraud investigation. It detailed the IP addresses, the timeline, and the exact statutes violated by Caleb's actions. It was fully completed, signed, and ready to mail. It was not a bluff. I needed them to look at it and understand that my finger was resting heavily on the trigger. I sat in the driver's seat of my car before starting the engine. I unlocked my phone and pulled up the screenshot I had taken at the airport in Portugal. I stared at the bright red notification displaying the 43 missed calls. A few weeks ago, that image would have sent a paralyzing wave of guilt crashing through my nervous system. I would have looked at those numbers and seen my own failure as a daughter. Now, sitting in the quiet calm of my car, I looked at that same image and saw something entirely different. It was not a symbol of my selfishness. It was the prologue to their prosecution. It was the exact moment they handed me the sword I was about to use. I put the car in gear and drove across the city as the late afternoon sun began to dip below the tree line. The familiar route to my childhood home usually filled me with a creeping sense of dread. But tonight, my heart beat with a slow, steady rhythm. I was completely detached. I turned onto their quiet, suburban street and coasted toward the house. The porch light was on, casting a warm, deceptive glow across the manicured lawn. I pulled my vehicle over to the curb and put the car in park. I looked at the driveway. Caleb's oversized black truck was parked aggressively near the garage doors. My parents' sedan was parked just behind it. But there was a third vehicle, parked neatly on the street, directly in front of the walkway. Was a sleek, expensive silver sedan I had never seen before. I watched as the front door of my parents' house opened. A man I did not recognize stepped out onto the porch to take a phone call. He was wearing a sharp-tailored navy suit and holding a leather briefcase. My mother had not invited me to a family dinner. She had lured me into a corporate ambush. They had brought their own negotiator. I tightened my grip on the steering wheel, a cold smile touching the corners of my mouth. I picked up my black binder, stepped out of the car, and walked toward the front door. I stepped through the heavy oak front door of my childhood home, the familiar scent of roasted garlic and rosemary immediately hitting me. It was my mother's classic culinary deflection, a pathetic attempt to mask a war zone with the comforting aroma of a Sunday roast. But nobody was eating. The dining room table was fully set with the good china, yet the chairs were pushed back, The atmosphere coiled so tightly it felt difficult to draw a breath. My father sat at the head of the table, his face a tight mask of defensive pride. My mother hovered near the kitchen archway, wringing a linen napkin between her hands. Caleb slouched in his usual seat, attempting to project an aura of bored annoyance, but the rapid tapping of his heel against the hardwood floor betrayed his panic. Then there was the stranger. He stood near the china cabinet, looking entirely out of place in our suburban dining room. Caleb introduced him with a wave of his hand as Miles Renner, his new financial advisor. One look at the dark circles under Miles's eyes and the tense set of his jaw told me exactly who he was. He was not an advisor. He was a crisis management specialist, brought in to desperately restructure the massive debt before the entire Cedar Vale venue collapsed like a house of cards. Before I even pulled out my chair to sit down, Caleb launched his offensive. He leaned forward, aggressively invading my space across the polished mahogany. "You are blowing this completely out of proportion, Riley." Caleb spat, trying to frame the narrative before I could speak a single word. "You always do this. You take a minor administrative shortcut and turn it into a federal crisis. It was just a digital placeholder, a technicality to keep the application moving while you were flying. You are threatening to destroy my entire business, my entire life, over a simple computer glitch." Historically, this was the exact moment I would have exploded. I would have raised my voice, defended my character, and fallen directly into the emotional mud pit he had dug for me to keep the focus off his actions. Instead, I remained standing. I unclasped my leather tote bag, pulled out the heavy black binder Leona and I had meticulously assembled, and dropped it onto the center of the dining table. The thick stack of paper hit the wood with a loud, authoritative thud that made my mother physically jump back. "I am not going to argue with you about my character or my vacation," I stated, my voice stripping away every ounce of sisterly warmth. I opened the binder to the very first tab. "At 10:11 on Thursday night, Mom called demanding I drive to your office. At 3:15 the following morning, while I was in a rideshare heading to the airport. An internet protocol address registered to the Cedar Vale office logged into a boutique commercial lending portal. At 6:15, exactly when I was handing my physical passport to a TSA agent, someone sitting at your desk forged my electronic signature. By Friday afternoon, a partial disbursement of $35,000 was wired directly into your operating account." The color drained instantly from Miles Renner's face. He stepped away from the china cabinet, his professional composure entirely shattered. He looked from Caleb to me, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization. "You have the exact internet protocol logs?" Miles asked, his voice tight and breathless. "Did you formally contact the commercial lender?" "I retained a corporate litigation attorney," I replied, locking my gaze directly on Miles. "We filed a formal fraud dispute and issued a legally binding document preservation notice to the lender, to Cedar Vale, and to 3 of your unpaid event vendors. The entire digital trail is permanently locked down." Miles exhaled a sharp, profane breath and dragged a heavy hand across his face. He understood instantly. He thought he had been hired to negotiate a messy, informal family loan dispute. He had just realized he was sitting in the exact center of a massive, fully documented commercial fraud case. If this went public, his ability to negotiate with creditors and save the venue plummeted to absolute zero. Seeing his hired gun panic, Caleb completely lost control. The smug, bored facade vanished, replaced by the desperate flailing of a man entirely out of options. He scrambled to find a shield, and in a move that shocked the entire room, he violently turned on his own father. "I did not come up with it on my own," Caleb yelled, pointing a trembling finger at Dennis. "Dad told me to do it. He was the one who said we just needed to put Riley's name on the application to make the file look good to the underwriters. He said she would never find out until the wedding cleared and the money was paid back." A collective gasp seemed to suck all the oxygen straight from the room. It was the very first time in Caleb's entire life that he had not hidden behind his parents. but actively dragged one of them down into the dirt to save himself. My father's face turned a violent shade of crimson. He slammed his fist onto the table, rattling the unused silverware against the plates. "Do not put words in my mouth. Caleb, I told you we would ask your sister to step in and secure the file. I never once told you to go online and forge her signature behind her back." I shifted my gaze to my mother. Throughout this entire explosive exchange, Marla had not said a single word. She was staring blankly at the floor. The linen napkin twisted so tightly in her hands her knuckles were stark white. Her prolonged silence was the loudest sound in the room. It was the absolute, undeniable confirmation that she had known about the forgery long before she ever picked up the phone to call me that night. Her panic over the caterer had been a designated, calculated distraction. I did not let the chaos derail my objective. I flipped the heavy binder to the third tab and slid a crisp, white legal document across the table toward Caleb. "This is a 72-hour standstill agreement," I announced, my tone slicing cleanly through their yelling. "I am giving you exactly 3 days. Within those 72 hours, you will hand over the entire unredacted financial ledger of Cedar Vale House to my attorney. You will sign a legally binding admission that you misused my identity, and you will immediately remove my name from every single piece of corporate paperwork you possess. If you do this, I will temporarily pause the submission of the criminal fraud complaint to the state." Caleb stared at the paper as if it were coated in poison. He shook his head wildly. "You cannot do this to your own family. You are using a lawyer to bully us. You are trying to steal my company from me." Before I could respond, Miles Renner stepped forward and slammed his hand flat on the table, cutting Caleb off completely. "Shut your mouth, Caleb," Miles snapped. All pretense of professional courtesy entirely gone. He pointed a sharp finger directly at the drafted document. "You are completely delusional. Look at the timeline she just read. She has you dead to rights on federal wire fraud and identity theft. She is giving you a way out that many people in her position would absolutely never give. You need to stop crying and read the terms." The room fell into a stunned, heavy silence. Caleb looked at Miles, entirely betrayed that his paid advocate had turned against him. He reached out with a trembling hand to pull the draft agreement closer. But before his fingers could touch the paper, a sharp, piercing electronic ring shattered the quiet. It was my mother's cell phone, resting face up next to the gravy boat on the table. The caller ID flashed brightly, displaying the name of the premier floral and lighting vendor they had hired for the upcoming weekend. Marla panicked. She lunged for the phone, intending to silence it, but her shaking fingers fumbled awkwardly against the glass screen. Instead of rejecting the call, she accidentally swiped the green button and put the call on speaker. A loud, furious voice echoed through our quiet dining room, bouncing off the walls and filling the space with absolute terror. "Marla, do not even try to give me another excuse," the vendor shouted, his voice laced with pure, unadulterated rage. "I checked with the commercial lender. They froze your bridge funding account an hour ago because of an identity dispute. I am entirely out of patience. If the remaining $40,000 balance is not wired into my account by 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, I am not just canceling the wedding setup. I am taking that fake guarantee file your son sent me straight to the Portland Police Department." The drive back to my own quiet neighborhood that Sunday evening was a blur of cold rain and fading adrenaline. The vendor's screaming voice from the speakerphone still echoed in my ears. A brutal soundtrack to the total collapse of the Hughes family illusion. I had barely walked through my front door, kicked off my shoes, and poured myself a glass of water when my cellular phone vibrated against the kitchen counter. The caller ID displayed my father's name. When I answered, the voice on the other end was entirely unrecognizable. Dennis Hughes, a man who had spent his entire life issuing absolute commands and demanding unquestioning respect, was actively weeping. He did not yell. He did not order me to fall in line. Instead, his voice cracked with a terrifying, hollow desperation. He confessed the final, devastating truth they had been hiding for over 6 months. They had taken out a massive second mortgage on their retirement home to keep Caleb's sinking venue afloat. The sheer gravity of the disaster washed over me, heavy and suffocating. If Cedar Vale House defaulted on its massive web of merchant cash advances and vendor invoices, the catastrophic chain reaction would not just bankrupt my brother. It would result in the bank foreclosing on the only home my parents owned. They would be entirely destitute in their late 60s. A younger, more emotionally volatile version of myself would have immediately drained my own savings account to save them from the streets. But standing in the quiet safety of my kitchen, looking at Evan, who was watching me with steady, supportive eyes, my core principle held completely firm. I would absolutely not pump unconditional cash into a structurally doomed enterprise. I was no longer interested in saving Caleb from his consequences. My only objective now was saving the absolute truth and stopping the financial bleeding before it destroyed my own life. First thing Monday morning, I was sitting across from Leona Graves in her mahogany-paneled office. We bypassed the emotional wreckage entirely and built a ruthless, three-tiered emergency containment strategy. Layer 1 was securing an immediate legal standstill agreement with the panicked vendors, offering them a guaranteed, legally binding payment schedule in exchange for their silence and a halt on all police involvement. Layer 2 was the absolute, non-negotiable freezing of Caleb's signatory rights. He could no longer be legally allowed to authorize a single transaction, sign a single contract, or touch a single bank account associated with Cedar Vale. Layer 3 was the ultimate bitter pill. I tapped into my extensive professional network at Stonemere Civic Works and called in a favor. I secured the services of an independent, highly aggressive small business restructuring expert named Paula Kent. Paula was a financial surgeon who specialized in taking over failing enterprises, stripping away the rot, and forcing immediate operational discipline. She would step in as the interim financial manager. But only under one strict condition: Caleb had to sign a formal, legally binding document surrendering total operational control of his own company to her. As Leona finalized the dense legal paperwork, my phone buzzed with an incoming message from my cousin Nora. It contained a single, attached audio file and a brief text explaining that since she lived in a one-party consent state, the recording she had made during a frantic phone call with Caleb several days prior was entirely legal. I put my headphones in, pressed play, and listened to my brother's voice. The audio was crisp. Caleb was speaking rapidly to Nora, laying out his fraudulent strategy with chilling, premeditated clarity. "Do not worry about the signature," Caleb's recorded voice confidently declared. "I know exactly when her flight takes off. We just wait until she is on the plane and completely out of cellular range. Once she is up in the air, I will handle the digital verification myself. She will never even know it happened until the money is already cleared." A profound, icy calm settled over my entire nervous system. Hearing him explicitly outline the premeditated theft of my identity erased any lingering microscopic shred of guilt I might have harbored. I did not immediately forward the recording to Leona. I did not send it to my parents. I saved the audio file locally to my device. I knew exactly when and where I would deploy it. My goal was not to inflict emotional pain. My goal was to construct an inescapable, steel trap that completely eliminated his ability to deny reality. I instructed Leona to summon the entire group to her corporate conference room at 2 o'clock that afternoon. When Caleb walked through the glass doors, flanked by my exhausted parents and Miles Renner, the tension was thick enough to crack teeth. I did not offer pleasantries. I slid the massive restructuring package across the wide mahogany conference table. I laid out the absolute ultimatum. Caleb had to sign the operational surrender, handing the keys of his empire over to Paula Kent. Furthermore, he had to sign a formal civil admission stating he had utilized my name and credentials entirely without my authorization, and he had to agree to a long-term restitution plan under Paula's direct supervision. If he signed, I would permanently bury the criminal fraud complaint. If he refused, Leona would physically hand-deliver the entire dossier to the State Financial Crimes Division the following morning at 9 o'clock sharp. Caleb exploded. The sheer narcissistic injury of being ordered to step down from his own company shattered his remaining composure. He stood up, knocking his heavy leather chair backward, and began screaming that this was a hostile, vindictive takeover. He accused me of harboring a lifelong jealousy of his entrepreneurial spirit and attempting to steal his business out from under him while he was vulnerable. I looked past my raging brother and locked eyes with my mother. For the very first time in my entire life, Marla Hughes did not leap to her golden child's defense. She had spent the last 24 hours reading the meticulously documented digital evidence, the timestamps, and the Internet protocol logs. The undeniable, printed reality of his criminal actions had finally broken through her decades of enabling. She sat completely frozen in her chair, staring at the glossy surface of the conference table, utterly silent. "I am not signing a single page of that garbage," Caleb sneered, slamming his palms flat against the table and glaring at me. "You are entirely bluffing, Riley. You do not have the guts to send your own blood relative to federal prison. You are just trying to humiliate me." I reached for my phone, my thumb hovering over the saved audio file Nora had sent me, ready to drop the final, devastating anvil. But I did not have to press play. Right at that exact second, Miles Renner let out a sharp, breathless curse. He had been staring at his own cellular phone, refreshing the banking application for Cedar Vale. Miles slowly looked up, his face entirely drained of blood, resembling a man who had just watched a fatal car crash. "It does not matter if you sign the restructuring plan right now, Caleb," Miles said, his voice dropping to a terrified, hollow whisper. "The commercial lender just sent an automated alert. The entire Cedar Vale operating account has been placed on a hard, administrative freeze due to an active identity verification dispute. We cannot move a single dollar. The payroll checks you wrote yesterday are going to bounce in exactly 2 hours." The morning light filtering through the heavy horizontal blinds of Leona Graves's corporate conference room was incredibly unforgiving. It illuminated the exhausted, pale faces gathered around the massive polished mahogany table at precisely 9 o'clock in the morning. This was no longer a messy Sunday dinner argument held over cold roast chicken. It was the absolute, terminal end of the line. I sat perfectly upright beside Leona, with Paula Kent, the aggressive restructuring specialist I had brought in, seated strictly to my right. Across from us sat Caleb. He looked physically ill, flanked by our parents and his crisis manager, Miles Renner. The frozen operating accounts had backed Caleb into a concrete corner he could absolutely not manipulate his way out of. Yet, true to his deeply ingrained nature, Caleb attempted one final, desperate deflection. He leaned forward, his eyes darting frantically around the sterile room, and pointed a shaking finger directly at me. He claimed I was orchestrating a massive, vindictive frame job. He loudly declared to the room that I had fabricated the digital signature logs myself to stage a hostile takeover of his venue, now that it was on the verge of turning a massive profit. He pleaded with our father, begging him to see how cruel and jealous his sister was being. I did not raise my voice to interrupt him. I did not defend my character. I simply opened my silver laptop. I turned the bright screen toward the center of the table so everyone could see. I brought up the timeline, the electronic verification emails, the one-time password text messages, and the official Internet Protocol server logs. Then, without a single word of introduction, I clicked on the audio file my cousin Nora had sent me. I turned the volume all the way up. The pristine acoustics of the corporate boardroom captured every single syllable of Caleb's recorded voice perfectly. The entire room listened to him confidently explain his strategy to wait until my flight took off so he could bypass the digital verification while I was thousands of feet in the air. He explicitly, proudly laid out the premeditated theft of my financial identity. The silence that followed the end of the recording was absolute. It was a suffocating, heavy quiet that finally and violently broke the Hughes family delusion. My father, a man who had spent his entire lifetime projecting unwavering authority and defending his son's visionary spirit, physically crumbled in his large leather chair. He dropped his face into his rough hands, letting out a ragged, hollow sob that echoed off the glass walls. Dennis finally realized that his endless financial bailouts and blind defense of his son had not fostered an entrepreneurial genius. He had cultivated a breathtakingly arrogant fraud. Next to him, my mother began to weep. But for the very first time in my 37 years of life, her tears were not a manipulative tactic designed to make me yield and fix the problem. Marla looked across the wide table at me, her eyes red and filled with genuine, crushing shame. She apologized. She did not apologize for ruining my anniversary trip or calling me late at night. She apologized for the fundamental way she had viewed me my entire life. She confessed, her voice trembling, that she had always treated my stability, my hard-earned money, and my constant sacrifices as a communal family resource. A natural well they were all automatically entitled to drink from whenever Caleb ran dry. I let her heavy words hang in the air, absorbing the profound shift in our dynamic. But I did not let her tears soften my legal resolve. I looked at Leona, who smoothly slid the final, thick stack of legal documents across the table. I delivered the absolute, final terms of my surrender. I informed them that I would not file the formal criminal charges with the State Fraud Division today. However, my mercy came with an ironclad, non-negotiable price. Caleb had to sign a legally binding civil admission of his fraudulent actions. He had to formally step down from all executive control of Cedar Vale House immediately, handing full and total operational authority over to Paula Kent. He had to accept the draconian restructuring protocols and a highly supervised, long-term repayment plan. Then came the final condition, the true severing of the toxic cord that had bound me for decades. Leona presented a specific, irrevocable legal injunction. By signing it, Caleb and my parents legally acknowledged that, from this day forward, I was not a strategic member, I was not a financial guarantor, and I was not an authorized representative for any family enterprise, past, present, or future. The document explicitly stated that any future use of my name, my credit, or my likeness in any capacity whatsoever would trigger immediate, unmitigated criminal prosecution. There would be no warnings and no family mediation dinners. Caleb stared at the heavy metal pen resting on top of the documents. He looked to our father for salvation. Dennis turned his face away, staring blankly at the wall. Caleb looked to our mother. Marla kept her eyes firmly planted on the table, refusing to meet his gaze. Finally, he looked to Miles Renner, who simply nodded his head toward the paper, silently urging him to take the only sliver of a lifeline he had left. For the very first time in his entire life, there was absolutely no cushion waiting to catch Caleb's fall. His golden child armor had completely shattered into dust. With a violently trembling hand, Caleb picked up the pen and signed his name across every single page. The transition in the following months was brutal. Miles and Paula immediately took over the wreckage of the business. They managed to unfreeze the accounts just enough to cover the minimum payroll and prevent a total vendor walkout for that upcoming weekend's wedding, avoiding immediate and total bankruptcy. Over the next several months, the grand empire Caleb had envisioned was aggressively downsized. Paula liquidated a significant portion of Cedar Vale's physical assets just to appease the furious creditors. My parents managed to save their retirement home from the bank foreclosure, but their lifestyle changed drastically. They were forced to live a stark, tightly constrained life, severely constrained by the massive debt they were now helping to service. Most importantly, they finally respected my boundaries. They no longer called me with daily emergencies. The designated crisis manager had permanently resigned, exactly 7 months after the disaster in Leona's office. Evan and I found ourselves standing in another airport terminal. We were boarding a long flight to Costa Rica. This time, we were not flying out to escape another family crisis. We were simply traveling to enjoy the beautiful. quiet life we had worked so hard to build together. We settled into our seats, the bright morning sun streaming through the oval airplane windows. Just as the flight attendant announced the final cabin door closure over the intercom, my phone vibrated in my lap. I looked down at the illuminated screen. It was an unknown number calling. A familiar, tiny spike of adrenaline touched my chest. An old survival reflex from a past life, but it faded just as quickly as it arrived. I smiled, a genuine expression of absolute freedom. I did not wonder who it was. I did not worry about what terrifying fire might be burning back in Portland. I calmly swiped the screen and engaged airplane mode. The screen went completely dark. I leaned my head against Evan's strong shoulder, listening to the powerful roar of the jet engines spinning up. I was no longer afraid of missed calls, because this time, even if I landed and found 43 of them waiting for me, they would no longer define who I was. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please leave a comment below so we can interact and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to the Zoe Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by many more people.